It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin I'd inherited from my late uncle. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Vermont, about an hour's drive from the nearest town, Maplewood. I was 28 years old at the time, freshly burnt out from my job as a newspaper editor in Burlington. I needed silence, space, and some kind of break from the noise of city life and the endless deadlines. The cabin itself was small, just one story, built from rough logs with a sagging roof and a stone chimney. It sat on a slight rise overlooking a narrow stream that wound its way through a thick stand of pines and hardwoods. The trees were just beginning to turn orange and yellow, and the air was crisp and cold, smelling like wet leaves and pine needles. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows between the trees. My old pickup truck bounced along the gravel road before finally stopping near the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and a rush of cold air came out. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly damp. I'd been told by the family that the cabin had been empty for years, maybe since my uncle's death a few winters before. Inside, the cabin was simple but sturdy. A small wood stove sat in the corner, a rough pine table and 2 chairs stood in the middle of the main room, and a narrow bed with a faded quilt was tucked in one corner. There were some shelves with old cooking pots and a few books, most of them falling apart or covered in dust. I set my bag down and got a fire going in the stove. The first crackle of the wood burning sounded loud and alive in the quiet cabin. Outside, the woods were already darkening fast, and the distant call of a lone owl floated through the air. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and a piece of bread, then sat by the fire, feeling the warmth soak into my cold bones. The next morning, I woke early, the sun filtering through the small window in golden shafts. I stepped outside, hoping to explore the area a bit before the day wore on. The forest was dense and still. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot as I wandered down the path that led toward the stream. The sound of running water grew louder as I neared the banks. The stream was narrow and shallow, but clear and cold. I knelt to splash some water on my face. It was peaceful here, so far away from people. The silence was nearly complete except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of a squirrel in the underbrush. As the day passed, I wandered further along the stream, noticing signs of wildlife. Deer tracks, scattered pine cones, broken branches where an animal might have passed. The air was cooler in the shade, and the sun was quickly swallowed by the thick canopy. Late in the afternoon, I headed back to the cabin. As I climbed the hill, I saw something odd near the edge of the trees by the cabin's back porch. A shape, a heap of something dark and still. At first, I thought it was just a fallen pile of branches or an old tarp, but the shape looked wrong. It was too bulky, too uneven. Curiosity made me step closer, and as I got nearer, the shape resolved into something far more disturbing. A man's body, slumped and motionless. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, and his skin was pale with a strange grayish tint. His face was turned away, pressed against the cold ground. My heart thumped painfully in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break over my skin. The body was no stranger. It looked like someone who had been here for days, maybe longer. I didn't see any obvious wounds or blood. It was just a dead man, lying there in the dirt, with his arms stretched out and his legs bent awkwardly. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root. My mind raced. Who was he? How did he get here? Why had no one found him before? I thought about going back into the cabin to call the police, but my phone had no signal. The nearest place with service was miles away in town. I tried again, but the screen stayed blank. It was like the forest swallowed all radio waves. I didn't want to touch the body. I didn't want to move it. I only stood there, shaking, my eyes wide and fixed on the man who had died in the woods near my uncle's cabin. It was late afternoon when I finally forced myself to look closer. The man was middle-aged, maybe in his 40s. His face was lined with dirt and grime, but his eyes were closed as if he were asleep. His hands were stiff, his fingers curled tightly. The ground beneath him was soft with fallen leaves and moss, and the cold air smelled faintly of earth and rot. I noticed then that his shoes were wet and caked with mud. Maybe he had tried to cross the stream and slipped. Or maybe he had been running from something that caught up with him in these woods. I searched the area nearby for any clues, a dropped wallet, a piece of paper, or some ID. But all I found were a few empty cans, crushed and rusted, and some broken branches that looked like they'd been snapped in a struggle. The sun dipped lower. The shadows grew longer, the woods turning darker and colder. I looked at the cabin, feeling suddenly very small and alone. I decided to go inside and wait until morning. I locked the door, closed the windows, and started a fire in the stove. I watched the flames flicker, casting a warm orange glow across the rough wooden walls. I tried to eat some canned food, but my stomach twisted in knots. The thought of the dead man just outside gnawed at my mind. Who was he? How long had he been there? Had someone hurt him? Was it an accident or something worse? That night, I hardly slept. Every sound outside, the creak of trees, the distant howl of a coyote, made me jump. I kept thinking about the man and the strange quietness of the woods around the cabin. The next morning, I made a plan. I needed to get help, even if it meant hiking miles back to the road and then driving into town. Before leaving, I covered the body with a blanket I found in the cabin. It was cold outside, and the man looked vulnerable lying there like that. I didn't know him, but I felt a strange sense of responsibility. The hike back to the road was long and exhausting. The forest seemed less friendly now, like it was hiding secrets I didn't want to find. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched but seeing no one. When I finally reached the gravel road, I was relieved to see a passing car. I flagged it down and told the driver about the dead man near the cabin. The police came out quickly, along with a medical examiner. They were serious and professional, asking me many questions. I told them everything I saw, how I found the body, and what I thought might have happened. They told me the man was likely a drifter who had been missing for over a week. His name was Richard Mason, a local who had fallen on hard times. They suspected exposure and dehydration as the cause of death, but were also investigating the possibility of foul play. The cabin was searched thoroughly. They found nothing else out of the ordinary, just the usual signs of an old, empty cabin. After the police left, I stayed behind for a few days, trying to make sense of everything. The cabin felt different now, heavier somehow. The woods were silent in a way that wasn't peaceful but empty. I packed my things and locked the cabin door for the last time. Driving away, I looked back once, the tall pines standing like silent witnesses to a man's last moments. The experience stayed with me for years. The quiet death of a stranger in a forgotten place. The feeling of being alone but not safe. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be, how the wild places could hide stories no one wanted to hear. But at least the man's body was found. At least someone knew his name and what happened to him. I never returned to that cabin, and I doubt I ever will. I never thought I would spend a night that tested everything I believed about safety and solitude in the woods. My name is Mark Stevenson. I'm 34 years old, a park ranger for the Eagle Creek State Park, a dense, rugged forest area about 50 miles east of Portland, Oregon. I had been working there for nearly 5 years by the time the events I'm about to describe happened in October 2011. I'm still trying to understand everything that unfolded that night, but I owe it to myself and maybe to others to put it all into words. The Eagle Creek Ranger Station was a small, sturdy wooden cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, where the forest thinned out to meet a winding river. It was the kind of place that felt isolated but secure. The forest around it was thick with Douglas firs, hemlocks, and moss-covered cedars, the ground carpeted in needles and ferns. The air was cold but crisp that late autumn, with a slight bite that hinted winter was coming soon. I had been assigned to stay overnight to keep watch over the area during a stretch when park visitors were thin, but there had been reports of illegal hunters in the backcountry, people ignoring park rules and endangering the wildlife. My job was to patrol, keep an eye out, and report anything suspicious. The day had gone like any other. I spent the afternoon hiking the usual trails, checking for signs of hunters, and noting areas where new traps or signs might have been set. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the call of a distant hawk. I had my usual gear, a rifle, flashlight, radio, and basic supplies, carried in my worn backpack. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. It was small but comfortable inside, with a wood stove that heated the place when I stoked it up, a simple metal cot, a small kitchen area, and a desk stacked with maps and patrol logs. The windows looked out onto the darkening forest, and the only sounds inside were the occasional creak of wood and the faint whistle of wind through the trees. I cooked a simple dinner on the small propane stove, canned chili heated in a pot, and ate quietly, listening to the sounds outside. As night fell, I made sure my rifle was cleaned and ready. I checked my radio. The signal was weak this far from the nearest town, but still workable for emergencies. I kept it on low volume but monitored the channel. At around 9 p.m., after finishing the last of my notes, I sat near the window, staring out into the dense black of the forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and twisting in the moonlight. The only light outside came from the stars peeking through breaks in the canopy, and the faint glow of the distant river reflecting the moon. Suddenly, I heard something unusual. It was a low, irregular thumping, soft but deliberate, coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing around the cabin. I froze, listening carefully. The noise repeated 3 slow thumps, then a pause, then 2 more. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too steady, too patterned. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened the door, stepping out onto the small porch. The air was colder now, and the woods felt thicker in the dark. I swept the beam of my flashlight slowly over the clearing and then into the trees. Nothing moved except for the occasional sway of branches in the breeze. I stayed outside for a few minutes, shining the light into the shadows. The noise stopped. I didn't hear anything else. The forest seemed to settle back into silence. I told myself it was probably just a tree branch knocking against a fallen log, or maybe a raccoon or other animal. Still, I locked the door behind me and returned inside, closing the curtains to block out the view. The feeling of being watched crept in, but I pushed it aside. I had done this job long enough to know that the woods played tricks on your mind at night. About an hour later, while I was organizing my gear by the stove, the power went out. The cabin was off the grid, powered by a small solar panel and a backup battery system. But the cloudy sky had meant the battery was already low. Now, everything went dark except for the flickering light of the stove fire. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the fuse box.
No blown fuses.
The battery must have died. No radio signal either now. I decided to get some rest and put my rifle near the bed. The night was long and I needed to stay alert, but the exhaustion was heavy. I lay down, the cot creaking beneath me, and stared up at the low ceiling, listening to the forest. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and causing the branches to scrape against the cabin walls. The thumping noise started again, but this time closer. 3 slow knocks on the cabin's outer wall, followed by a pause, then 2 more. I sat up, heart pounding. It was definitely someone or something trying to make contact, or to warn me away. I grabbed the rifle, moving quietly to the window, peeking through a crack in the curtain. The flashlight beam outside was gone. I opened the door cautiously, stepping outside into the cold night. My flashlight swept the clearing, then the forest edge, but there was nothing to be seen. No footprints in the damp soil or the thin layer of fallen leaves near the cabin. The pattern of the thumping was exactly the same as before: 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. The sound was coming from the forest, maybe 15 feet from the porch. I grabbed my rifle and stepped toward the trees, shining the beam into the darkness. The forest was dense, and the light barely penetrated the blackness between the trees. Then I saw it, a figure tall and thin, standing motionless just beyond the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. The light caught the glint of a small reflective patch on their jacket, probably the reflective stripes common on hunting gear or park worker uniforms. I froze. The figure did not move, only stood still. There was no other sound but the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I spoke aloud to myself, telling the person to identify themselves, but no answer came. The figure raised a hand slowly, then lowered it. Suddenly, the figure turned and vanished into the woods without a sound. My heart hammered in my chest as I raised the flashlight and called out, but only silence answered. I hurried back inside, locking the door and closing the curtains tight. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, thinking about what I had just seen. It was likely an illegal hunter or trespasser, someone who did not want to be found. I spent the next hours on edge, keeping my rifle close, checking the windows, listening for sounds in the dark. The wind died down around 2 a.m., and the forest grew quiet. At dawn, I woke to the smell of smoke. I rushed outside to see a thin line of smoke rising from the forest about a quarter mile away. My heart dropped. Someone had started a fire. I grabbed my radio and tried to call the main station, but no signal. I packed my gear quickly and ran toward the smoke, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of people or flames. The fire was small but spreading fast through the dry brush. I found some water from a nearby stream and used my jacket to beat down the flames, trying to slow it until help arrived. I saw footprints around the area, 2 sets leading into the forest, away from the fire. Someone had lit it deliberately. I returned to the cabin and called the sheriff's department on my cell phone, finally getting through. I reported the fire and the suspicious figure. They sent a team out, and later, I learned they caught 2 illegal hunters hiding in a remote part of the park. They had started the fire to cover their tracks after seeing me patrolling. That night changed me. I realized how vulnerable you are out in the woods alone, even with experience and preparation. The forest is beautiful, but it can hide danger that no legend or ghost story could match. It was a real threat, human and raw. From that day on, I never underestimated the silence of the forest or the people who might lurk in its shadows. I kept my guard high, but I also respected the place more, because the forest doesn't care if you're scared. It just watches and waits. It was the fall of 2013 when I decided to take a week off from my job at a steel fabrication plant in Columbus, Ohio. I was 35 then, single, and needed a break from the noise, the machines, the clanking and dust that sat in your lungs by noon every day. I'd always found some peace in getting out of the city and into the woods, and that year, I wanted something even more remote than usual. Somewhere I wouldn't see another person for days. I picked a small cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, just west of Munising. I'd found it through an old friend who moved up there years ago and sometimes rented the place out to acquaintances for hunting season. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors for at least 4 miles. That's exactly what I was looking for. I drove up in my old gray Tacoma with a cooler full of food, a couple jugs of water, and all the gear I figured I'd need: my rifle, my bow, my blaze orange gear, a decent cot, and a bunch of canned food. The drive took 9 hours. The cabin was a simple structure: 4 walls, a tin roof, and a wood stove.
No plumbing.
The kind of place where the windows frosted from the inside in the mornings and the only toilet was an outhouse behind the tree line. The place sat maybe 200 yards off an old logging road, shielded by dense rows of spruce and pine. The guy who built it, someone named Len, hadn't used much insulation. When I walked inside, it felt colder than outside. There were some shelves with old, expired food, mouse droppings in the corners, and a battered old propane stove that looked like it hadn't worked since the 90s. Still, it had charm. It was quiet, and more importantly, it was mine for the week. I arrived on a Sunday. By Monday morning, I had my gear set up, the rifle cleaned and sighted in, and had done some scouting around. The land sloped down toward a swamp about a quarter mile to the east. To the west, beyond the cabin, was a ridge with decent elevation where I could see over a good stretch of forest. I placed a trail cam there. There were deer signs, fresh scat, rubs, and faint tracks in the mud. The first couple of days were uneventful, peaceful even. I'd rise early, make coffee on a camp stove, and hike out before sunrise. I'd sit for hours in the cold, watching. I saw some doe, but no bucks. The nights were long and black and cold. I kept the fire going in the stove and read a little by lantern light. I didn't bring much, just a worn paperback about tracking whitetail and a couple hunting magazines. When I wasn't out in the woods, I spent time splitting firewood and refilling the water jugs from a nearby creek, which I boiled before drinking. On Wednesday morning, something strange happened. I went out to check the trail cam I had strapped to a tree along the ridge. It had been working fine the day before. The strap was still in place, but the camera was gone. Clean off the mount like it had been pulled, not knocked off by an animal. The mount was still bolted into the tree, no signs of damage, just no camera. I looked around the base of the tree, thinking maybe it fell. Nothing. I figured maybe the plastic just got brittle from the cold and it snapped off. It bugged me, but I let it go. Later that afternoon, I thought I heard movement out near the swamp. Heavy movement. I was glassing the area through binoculars when I saw something quick move between the trees. I thought it might be a large buck, so I waited, but nothing showed again. I sat there until nearly dark, the kind of cold that makes your breath burn your nose and your fingers ache even in gloves. I got back to the cabin just after sunset. I opened the door and immediately noticed something was wrong. It wasn't the fire, still glowing orange in the stove. It was the smell. Not smoke, not the must of wood. It was faint but distinct, like something sour, rotten. It reminded me of how my granddad's cellar used to smell: mildewed potatoes and damp concrete. I checked the cooler, food was fine. Water jugs still sealed. I chalked it up to old wood and cold air. Still, I kept noticing it, lingering. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the smell, but because of the noise. Around 2 a.m., I heard crunching outside. First, I thought it was deer. Then it stopped and started again, this time slower, heavier, more deliberate. I sat up in my cot and didn't move. No wind, no animals running, just slow pacing. I had my rifle within reach. I held it across my lap, listening. At one point, the steps came right up to the cabin wall, just outside the window behind me. I didn't breathe. After a few minutes, the sounds faded off toward the trees. In the morning, I walked the perimeter. There were tracks, big ones, not boot prints, bare feet, human, but wide and rough, like someone who hadn't worn shoes in years. They started near the outhouse, circled the cabin, and vanished into the woods. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. It didn't feel like a prank. Who would hike 4 miles into the woods with no shoes in 30-degree weather? I didn't see a single print on the road coming in, just mine. I wanted to leave. That instinct, deep, old, primal, it kicked in. Something wasn't right, but I stayed. Not out of pride, but because I kept thinking maybe it was a drifter, some hermit living rough. People live strange lives in the woods. Maybe he was just passing through. That day, I took my rifle with me everywhere, even to piss. I hiked out to the creek around noon to fill up my jugs. The water was moving fast, shallow and clear. I knelt down, and as I was filling the second jug, I saw something across the water line, maybe 30 feet up the bank. A scarf, a red flannel one, torn at one end and tangled in the base of a fallen tree. I walked over and picked it up. It was stiff with ice but dry underneath. Then I saw the prints again in the frozen dirt nearby. Same wide, barefoot tracks. There were more this time, fresh. They led off into the woods, fast and irregular, like someone was stumbling or running. I didn't follow. That night was colder. I burned more wood, sat with my back against the cabin wall, staring at the door. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time it wasn't pacing. It was scraping, like something dragging a stick across the wood siding. Slow, rough, just below the window. I held my breath and waited. After maybe 10 minutes, it stopped. No footsteps this time.
No retreat.
Just silence. By morning, I was done. I packed up everything fast: gear, food, rifle. I threw it all in the truck by 8 a.m. I didn't clean. I didn't refill the wood bin. I just wanted out. I turned the truck onto the old logging road and headed for the main highway. Maybe a mile in, I saw something on the road. A deer, dead, sprawled sideways like it had been hit. But there was no blood, no damage. It wasn't bloated either, just lying there, still. Its neck was twisted too far, unnaturally, like someone had turned it past the point of braking and then laid it down gently. I stopped the truck and stared for a while. Then I drove around it. I made it back to Columbus that night, slept for 12 hours. I didn't tell anyone about the trip. Not really. When coworkers asked, I said it was quiet, cold, didn't see much. I left it at that. 3 months later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was my missing trail cam. The casing was cracked, and the SD card was gone. The only thing inside the box was a strip of paper with a typed message in block letters. You left early. I moved apartments a week later. Got a new number. Haven't gone hunting since. I was 31 that autumn when I decided to take a short break from work. I'd been working in Bristol for 7 years straight, only taking a few long weekends here and there, and I felt drained mentally and physically. The long hours, the gray office cubicles, and the endless deadlines were starting to wear me down. I lived alone in a small flat on the edge of the city and hadn't had any proper time away from everything in a long while. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted something completely different from my everyday life. I found the cabin online. It was in the Lake District, tucked away in a narrow valley near the edge of Grisdale Forest. The pictures showed a quiet wooden structure with moss along the shingles, a wood-burning stove inside, and no Wi-Fi. The listing said it was owned by an older couple who lived in a nearby village and rented it out during the off-season for hikers or people like me, just looking to disappear for a while. It looked rustic and empty, exactly what I needed. I booked it for 9 days. It was the first week of October 2021. The drive up took a good 6 hours, including a stop in Kendall for supplies. Basic stuff like bottled water, some tinned food, tea, eggs, bread, and a bit of whiskey. I didn't plan on doing anything exciting, just a few hikes maybe and a lot of reading. The road to the cabin was narrow and rough, more like a muddy trail than a road, winding between mossy trees and through fog that never seemed to lift completely. When I got there, the sun was already low and the air had that wet, cold smell that settles over forests in October. The cabin was just like the photos. wooden, weather-worn, with ivy starting to curl up one side and a small shed off to the left that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. There were no nearby houses, no cars, not even a visible footpath. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. No wind, no traffic, no distant dogs barking or people shouting. It was almost unnerving, but I convinced myself it was what I wanted. The inside of the cabin was basic. One main room with a bed in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a kitchenette that had an electric kettle and a mini fridge. The bathroom was tiny, with a water tank you had to fill yourself from a pump out back. There was no shower, just a sink and a compost toilet. It felt like a place people forgot, like it had been left behind by time. The first 2 days were peaceful. I lit fires at night, sipped whiskey, and read books I hadn't touched in years. I went on walks along the trails and took photos of moss-covered rocks and trees that looked hundreds of years old. I didn't see a single person. My phone had no signal, which I liked. I kept it off. The air was cold and the fog rarely lifted, but I liked that too. It gave the place a quiet, sleepy kind of mood that made it feel safe in a strange way. Then, on the 3rd night, things started to feel different. It was about 10 at night. I was inside, fire crackling, reading a paperback I'd brought with me. I went outside to grab more wood from the pile under the overhang. I'd been doing that each night. The cold was sharper that evening, and the fog was thicker than usual. When I stepped outside, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it, but the quiet felt heavier. I walked to the pile and bent down to grab a few logs. When I stood back up, I looked toward the tree line across the clearing. That's when I saw her. She was standing still, completely still, half hidden between 2 trees. At first I thought it was a tree stump or some shadow, but then I saw the outline of her coat and her pale face. She didn't move. She just stood there, facing the cabin, facing me. I stared for maybe 5 seconds. Felt longer. My brain tried to catch up. I squinted through the fog. She didn't move. She didn't walk away. She didn't wave or call out. I turned and went back inside. Quickly, I locked the door. Back inside, I stood by the window and looked out again. Nothing, just fog and darkness. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed, every sound amplified in the silence. I kept hearing things that could have been branches or animals or wind, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't get out of bed until the sun was well up. The next morning, I told myself it had been a trick of the fog, my tired eyes, or just a weird shadow. I forced myself to walk back into the trees, in the direction I thought she'd been. I didn't find anything. No tracks, no sign that someone had been there. Just damp leaves, moss, and silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That stillness, that posture. Something about it wasn't right. That evening, I closed all the curtains before dark. I kept the lights low and didn't go outside. I couldn't focus on my book. My brain kept drifting back to the shape in the trees, her pale face, her stillness. I didn't sleep again. I kept sitting up and listening. On the 5th day, I found something strange behind the cabin. I went to refill the water tank from the hand pump. While I was there, I noticed something behind the shed. I hadn't gone back there yet. It was a small area choked with brambles and ferns. But I saw something white. I pushed through the brush and found a pile of clothing, old and water-stained. What looked like a coat, maybe wool, covered in greenish algae from sitting there so long. Beside it was an old boot, a woman's boot. It wasn't buried or hidden. It was just left there, like someone had taken it off and never came back for it. I left it and went back inside. That was the first time I seriously considered leaving. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. That night, I woke up just before 2 in the morning. No reason, just woke up. The fire was out and it was cold. And then I heard footsteps, not inside, outside. Slow, deliberate crunching on gravel and leaves, moving around the cabin. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. They circled once, then silence. I waited for a long time. I didn't get up. I just lay there under the blankets, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. In the morning, I stepped outside. The fog was thick again, the ground wet. I looked around the cabin. That's when I noticed it. On the far window, the one facing the tree line, there were smudges. Smudges like fingers, like someone had pressed their hands to the glass. They weren't big, small hands, narrow fingers. I packed that morning. I knew I wouldn't make it another night, but when I started my car, nothing happened. I tried again, dead. I checked the battery cables. They were connected. The battery wasn't old. The car wasn't old. I'd had it serviced before the trip. I went back inside. I didn't know what else to do. That afternoon, I took a walk toward the village, hoping to find someone. The fog was heavier than ever. I didn't make it far before I heard something behind me. Footsteps again, quick ones. When I turned, there was nothing, just the trail and fog. That evening, as the light faded, I sat inside with the stove burning and the curtains closed. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the trees. At some point, I heard something on the roof. Not heavy, just light steps, like someone walking slowly, carefully. I didn't look. I stayed in bed, pulled the blankets over my head like a child. I waited until morning. When light finally came, I went outside. There were small muddy footprints on the cabin roof, leading up to the chimney, then vanishing. I don't know how she got up there. There was no ladder, no nearby tree strong enough. I didn't eat that day. I didn't drink. I stayed inside, pacing. The car was still dead. That night, she knocked. 3 knocks, then nothing. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark until sunrise. When morning came, I packed everything into my bag. I took my coat, my food, and left the rest. I started walking. I didn't care which direction. I just followed the trail as far as I could. I walked for nearly 5 hours before I reached a main road. Eventually, a farmer passed in a truck and gave me a lift into the nearest town. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I called a tow truck the next day and had them retrieve my car. The mechanic said the battery had been tampered with. The cables had been cut clean with something sharp. I never found out who she was. The cabin owner said no one else had rented the place in months. There were no other cabins nearby. No hikers reported missing. No locals matched her description. But I remember her face. Pale, quiet, watching from the trees. I remember the way she stood, the way she circled the cabin. How silent she was, how patient. I never went back. I sold the car. I moved out of the city and into a flat with more people around. I don't go on trips alone anymore. I don't go to remote places. I don't camp. I don't hike. I don't read books by candlelight. I don't leave the curtains open at night. And sometimes, when it's quiet, too quiet, I still see her face in my mind, pale, still, waiting. The year was 2019. I was 42 years old, living in a small town just outside of Duluth, Minnesota. The cold was creeping in early that year, the late October winds bringing a sharp bite to the air. The trees were mostly bare by then, their skeletal branches creaking against the gray sky. I just lost my ex-wife, Karen, a few months earlier. She had passed quietly in her sleep from a long battle with an illness we both thought would never end. After the funeral, after the final goodbyes, I found myself drifting, unsure of where to go or what to do. I decided to go to the cabin that Karen and I had bought years ago, long before we separated. It was deep in the woods, a place we once loved but hadn't visited in years. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was a small, single-story wooden building with a stone chimney, surrounded by towering pine trees. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and the road there was rough, gravel, and dirt, winding through the forest. I packed my truck with some essentials: food, water, a small first aid kit, blankets, and my old camping gear, and drove out early one Saturday morning. The sky was overcast, the kind of day that made the forest look darker than usual. As I drove, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Being alone in that cabin meant I could think, remember, maybe even find some peace. The drive itself was rough. The gravel road was littered with potholes and rocks, and branches brushed against the windows. I parked near the cabin around midday. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles, a familiar scent that I remembered from better days. The cabin looked the same but weather-worn. The wooden siding was dull, and the roof had patches of moss growing on it. The small porch creaked when I stepped on it. Inside, the cabin was cold. The wood floor felt hard and unwelcoming beneath my boots. Dust coated every surface. I could see the faint outline of the couch where Karen used to sit, the kitchen table scarred with years of use, and the fireplace empty and silent. The air smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke from long ago. I pulled open the windows to let fresh air in and began to unpack. I spent the afternoon clearing out some dead leaves from the porch and sweeping the floor. I found old newspapers from years ago stuffed under a chair. My thoughts drifted as I worked. Memories of better times mixed with a dull ache from loss. By evening, I built a small fire in the stone fireplace. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The sun set quickly. The sky outside darkened to an almost unnatural shade of black, but the stars were out in full force, tiny pinpricks of light in the cold night sky. I ate a simple meal: canned beans warmed over the fire, some bread, and coffee made from a small camping stove. The silence was thick, heavier than I expected. No sounds of cars, no voices, only the distant rustle of wind and occasional creaks from the old cabin. I set up my sleeping bag near the fireplace, the warmth of the fire comforting against the chill. Outside, the woods were quiet, too quiet. The trees stood tall and still, their outlines barely visible in the firelight through the windows. That night, I lay awake longer than I thought I would. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a creeping awareness that I wasn't alone, or at least not as alone as I wanted to be. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and making the old cabin groan and sway. The shadows on the walls seemed to flicker unnaturally. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was subtle at first, a faint scraping, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground just outside. I froze. The sound came again, more deliberate this time. It wasn't footsteps. It was heavier, uneven. Maybe branches brushing against something or an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stood up. The beam swept across the room and through the window. Outside, the moon was behind clouds, and the forest was a wall of blackness. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting into my skin through my jacket. I scanned the area, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. No animals, no people. Just the rustling of dead leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a deer or a raccoon, but my heart was pounding. I locked the door behind me and returned inside. I sat back down near the fire, trying to calm myself. The scraping noise didn't come again, but the feeling stayed, that uneasy tension that something was just beyond the edge of vision, watching, waiting. The night passed slowly. The fire died down to glowing embers, and I wrapped myself tighter in my sleeping bag. Sleep came in fits, broken by every small sound. At one point, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin, as if something heavy had hit the wall. I stayed still, listening. No more noise followed. Morning came gray and cold. I stepped outside to find the ground disturbed. The dirt and leaves near the cabin side were trampled. Broken branches lay scattered around. It looked like something or someone had circled the cabin in the night. I felt a cold wave of dread mixed with anger. Whoever or whatever it was had been close, too close. I had no cell service there, so I couldn't call for help. I decided to pack up and leave as soon as possible. As I gathered my things, I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the back of the cabin. They were large, irregular, and not human. Probably a big animal, maybe a bear or a large dog, but I couldn't be sure. The prints led away into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Before leaving, I checked the locks on the doors and windows. All seemed intact, no signs of forced entry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The drive back was tense. Every rustle outside my truck made me glance nervously in the mirrors. I kept the windows up and locked the doors. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was rising, casting pale light over the forest. Back home, I thought about the night. I hadn't felt truly alone in that cabin, and that feeling unsettled me more than any direct threat could have. I knew the woods were full of animals and strange noises, but the close presence of something, whether wild or human, made it different. In the days that followed, I found it hard to sleep. Every shadow in my house seemed to move. Every creak echoed like the cabin's. The quiet loneliness I sought had turned into something else, a lingering discomfort. But I also knew I had to face it. The cabin, the woods, my past with Karen. They were all part of my life story. I couldn't run from the memories or the fear they brought. Weeks later, I returned once more, this time with better preparations. Bear spray, a GPS device, and a small radio. I stayed only one night, keeping a close watch outside. The night was cold but quiet.
No scraping noises. No tours.
The forest was calm as it should be. That trip was the last time I went to the cabin. I sold the place a few months later. It wasn't the memories that pushed me away, but the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that some things in the woods can't be explained, but are very real nonetheless. Sometimes I wonder what it was that circled the cabin that night. Maybe it was just a bear or some wild animal hungry and curious. Or maybe it was something else. Someone or something watching, waiting for the right moment. But I'll never know for sure. And that, in a way, is enough. The rain started just as I finished hammering the last plank into place. The sound of water tapping steadily on the rough wooden roof was soothing at first, a rhythm that matched the tired beat of my own heart. I stood back and wiped the sweat and grime off my forehead. My clothes soaked from the day's work and the sudden downpour. The small cabin, barely bigger than a large tent, sat nestled between towering pines, hidden deep enough in the forest to feel like its own little world. The cabin was my project for the last 2 weeks, something I'd been dreaming about since I left the city. I'd been tired of the noise, the crowds, the endless hum of life always pushing me forward. Here, out in the wilds, it was just the forest and me. No deadlines, no phones ringing, no one demanding my attention. Just peace, or at least that's what I thought. The rain grew heavier, pounding harder on the metal roof I'd managed to patch with some old sheets I found in a nearby abandoned shed. The wind picked up, sending branches thrashing and leaves swirling around the cabin. I shut the small window I'd left open for ventilation, the latch catching with a clank that echoed a little too loud in the stillness. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, sitting down on a rough log I had dragged over as a makeshift bench. Inside, The cabin smelled of fresh pine and wet earth, mingled with the faint scent of sawdust and the smoke I'd kept burning earlier in a small stove. I'd built the stove myself out of some scrap metal, and it worked well enough to keep me warm in the chilly nights. Tonight, though, the fire had nearly died, and the dampness in the air crept inside, chilling my bones. I reached over and picked up a small tin lantern, shaking it gently to stir the wick. The flame flickered to life, casting long shadows against the uneven walls. The light made the wet wood glisten, and for a moment I felt a calm settle over me. The rain outside was relentless, drumming against the roof like a living thing trying to break in. I wasn't afraid of the rain, not really, but there was something about being alone in this small cabin, so far from the nearest town or road, that put a knot in my stomach. The forest around me was dense and dark, the trees heavy with rain, their branches bowing under the weight. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out there, the rustle of leaves as a squirrel or some small animal hurried through the undergrowth. I pulled a blanket from the corner where I had left my bedroll and wrapped it tightly around myself. The rain pattered on, a steady backdrop to my thoughts. I wasn't sure how long I would stay here, whether this little cabin would become a home or just a memory. But tonight, it was shelter from the storm, a small island of warmth in the cold, wet forest. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound just beyond the cabin wall, barely louder than the rain. My heart jumped. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, faint but distinct, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I set the lantern down slowly and moved toward the small window. Peering out through the wet glass, I tried to see past the sheets of rain, but the world outside was a blur of gray and black. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches scratching against each other. The scraping sound came again, this time accompanied by a low, dull thud. Something heavy was moving through the underbrush, close to the cabin. I stepped back, my breath shallow. I reminded myself that this was just the forest, wild and full of animals. Maybe a deer had gotten too close, or a bear sniffing around. I'd seen signs of bears here before, claw marks on trees, paw prints in the mud. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the noise didn't feel right. It was deliberate, slow, as if something was testing the cabin, checking its boundaries. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and flicked it on. The beam cut a thin path through the rain outside. I held it steady, waiting. Then the scratching stopped. The forest fell silent except for the rain. My muscles tensed, waiting for a sound, a movement. Nothing. I lowered the flashlight and turned to the stove. The fire had nearly died, just glowing embers left. I fed it some dry scraps I'd saved, coaxing the flames back to life. The warmth helped ease the cold, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to push the thoughts away and focus on the small comforts, the smell of pine and smoke, the soft crackle of fire, the rhythmic tapping of rain. I settled down on the bench, pulling my legs up close, and closed my eyes. For a while, the rain was the only sound. Then, faintly, the scratching started again, but this time from the other side of the cabin. My pulse quickened. I rose slowly, gripping the flashlight tightly. The beam flicked around the dark edges of the cabin, catching glimpses of wet leaves and shifting shadows. Then I saw it. A branch moving, not in the wind, but pushed aside by something. I moved quietly toward the door, each step slow and deliberate. Outside, the rain had slackened to a drizzle, the night suddenly calm. I cracked the door open a bit and shone the light into the darkness. The beam landed on a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting back at me from the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat. The eyes blinked and then disappeared into the trees. I shut the door and bolted it firmly, pressing my back against the cool wood. My mind raced through possibilities. Wild animals, a lost hunter, someone hiding. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the unknown or the thought of another person in the woods with me. The rain began again, softer now, a gentle patter. The forest settled into quiet. I stayed awake for hours, watching the shadows, listening for any sound. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The air was fresh and clean, the sky lightening to soft blues and grays. I stepped outside, cautious but curious. The ground was churned up near the cabin, footprints pressed into the wet earth, large and heavy, unlike any animal I'd seen around here. They led into the forest and stopped abruptly. I knew then that I wasn't alone last night. Someone had been watching, waiting, but whoever it was, they had gone with the first light. I packed my things soon after. The cabin, my dream, now felt different. Less a refuge, more a reminder that the forest holds more secrets than I'm ready to face. As I walked back to the dirt road, the sun breaking through clouds, I promised myself I'd be more careful next time. The wild isn't always kind, and sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people, real threats, hiding in the dark. It was late October 2019. I was 25 years old at the time, living in a small town in northern Michigan, where the forest stretched for miles and the air was sharp and cold. My stepbrother, Jake, was a few years older, 28, and a police officer with the local sheriff's department. We weren't super close, but we got along well enough. Growing up with different parents, our lives only really connected when we had to deal with family stuff. But Jake's cop stories always made an impression on me. The plan was simple enough. Jake invited me to spend a weekend at a cabin he had access to through a family friend. It was about a 2-hour drive outside town, deep in the woods near Houghton Lake. The cabin was rustic, with no electricity or running water, perfect for a weekend away from phones and noise. I was more city guy than outdoorsman, but I figured a weekend with Jake would be good to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and the idea of cold nights by a fire and fresh air was appealing. We left Friday afternoon, Jake driving his old pickup truck with me riding shotgun. The sun was low when we hit the dirt road that led to the cabin, a narrow path barely wide enough for one car, bordered by tall pines and the rusty orange of early fall leaves. The truck bounced over rocks and roots, dust clouding behind us. I watched the woods on either side, feeling a mix of calm and unease I couldn't quite place. When we pulled up to the cabin, it was just as Jake described. Small and weathered, with a stone chimney and a porch sagging a little under years of snow and rain. The windows were dirty but not broken. Around it, the forest stretched in every direction, darkening now as the sun dipped below the treetops. Jake pulled out the keys and let himself in first. The inside smelled of wood smoke and old pine. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by a few mismatched chairs and a rough wooden table. There was a small kitchen area with a sink that clearly didn't work and a wood stove. Upstairs, there were 2 tiny bedrooms with simple beds covered by thick quilts. We unpacked quickly. I didn't bring much, just some warm clothes, a flashlight, and a small backpack with food and water. Jake carried a hunting rifle he said was more for safety than sport, which I thought was odd but didn't question. He also brought his cop radio, which worked on the town's frequencies but was likely useless deep in the woods. The first night was quiet. We made a fire outside, cooked some canned chili over the flames, and sat in silence as the cold air crept in around us. Jake was relaxed, staring into the flames, while I felt my thoughts drift between the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the woods settling for the night. Distant owls, the rustle of small animals, the wind moving through the trees. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a twig snapping somewhere outside. I sat up, heart pounding. Jake was still asleep in the next room. I tried to listen but heard nothing else. Probably a deer or some raccoon. I told myself, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. The next day, Jake and I went out to explore the area. The woods were thick, the trees older and taller than I'd ever seen near the city. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves, and small streams trickled through rocky beds. Jake pointed out animal tracks, deer, fox, raccoon, and told me stories about calls he'd had in the area. I mostly listened, fascinated by the quiet beauty. By evening, though, a sense of tension had settled between us. Jake was quieter than usual, checking his radio and looking toward the forest edge with sharp eyes. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shrugged it off, saying it was nothing. That night was worse than the first. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's loose shutters and whistling through cracks in the walls. I lay awake, feeling like the shadows just outside the window were moving. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a sharp snap, like someone stepping on a branch just yards from the cabin. I nudged Jake, whispering, but he just said to stay calm. We sat by the fire inside, the rifle resting nearby. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but Jake's tense posture told me he didn't believe that either. At one point, the radio crackled to life. Jake grabbed it instantly. The voice was faint, broken, calling for help. Then nothing. Jake told me to stay inside while he went to check. I protested, but he was firm. He put on his jacket and grabbed the rifle. I watched him disappear into the dark, cold woods, the only light from his flashlight barely cutting through the night. Minutes stretched like hours. I heard nothing but the wind and the crackling fire. Then a shout, Jake's voice sharp and urgent. I grabbed the rifle and ran outside. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the way. I called his name but got no reply. The forest seemed endless, a wall of darkness pressing in. Then I saw it, the beam of Jake's flashlight moving fast, erratic. I ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. Jake was crouched near a fallen tree, tense and pointing his rifle toward the shadows. "Something's here," he said, voice low but firm. I looked where he was aiming and saw nothing but dark shapes. Suddenly, a man stepped out from behind the tree, tall, gaunt, eyes wild and darting. He was dirty, clothes torn and stained, and he held a knife in one hand. Jake raised his rifle. The man didn't run or fight. He just stared at us like he was desperate, maybe broken. Jake shouted something, but the man didn't answer. I felt frozen, every muscle tight. The man lunged at Jake, desperate and crazed. Jake fired once, a sharp crack echoing through the forest. The man dropped instantly. I felt sick, but Jake didn't look away. He checked the man's pulse, then radioed for backup. We waited together until the sheriff's department arrived, lights flashing and voices calling through the trees. The man was a local drifter, known to cause trouble but never this close to town before. Back at the cabin, Jake told me quietly that he thought the man had been hiding in the woods for weeks, maybe months. The isolation and desperation had broken him. I stayed with Jake that night, both of us too shaken to sleep alone. The next morning, the sun rose clear and cold. The forest seemed peaceful again, but I knew it held darker things beneath the surface. Not ghosts, but people broken by life, lost and dangerous. That weekend changed something between me and Jake. We didn't talk much about what happened, but I felt closer to him, understanding more about the weight he carried as a cop and the reality of the world outside my safe city life. I left the cabin with a new respect for the wilderness and the people who lived around it, not because of fairy tales or legends, but because sometimes real fear comes from the darkest parts of the human mind, lurking just beyond the trees. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to get away from everything. Work had been overwhelming for months. The constant emails, endless meetings, the pressure to perform. It all wore me down. I needed silence, a break from people, from noise, from city life. That's why I picked a small cabin deep in the pines of northern Minnesota. I'd spent years living in Minneapolis and always dreamed of escaping into the wilderness, even if just for a week. I was 29, working as a graphic designer, mostly stuck behind a computer screen. I booked the cabin online. Nothing fancy, just a small, rustic place called Pine Hollow. It sat on the edge of a big forest, near a narrow lake nobody really used. The owner promised privacy and no cell reception.
No Wi-Fi, no distractions.
Exactly what I wanted. When I drove up the long, bumpy dirt road leading to the cabin, I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in months. The sun was low, casting golden light through the tall pine trees. Birds chirped faintly, and the smell of fresh pine filled the air. I parked my old Honda by the porch and grabbed my bags. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, made of weathered logs with a sloped roof and a stone chimney. The windows were dirty but offered a clear view of the woods and lake behind. Inside, there was a tiny kitchen with a gas stove, a wood-burning stove for heat, a single bed, and a small table with 2 chairs. Everything was simple and worn but clean. I unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and sat by the window watching the forest grow darker. That first night, the silence was so deep it almost hurt. No cars, no planes, no city noise. Just the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of wind through the needles. I felt calm but a little uneasy too, like being watched. I reminded myself it was just the wilderness, nothing more. The next morning, I woke early to a foggy dawn. I made coffee on the stove and sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The lake was still and gray, the trees looming like silent giants. I planned to spend the day hiking a nearby trail marked on an old paper map the owner had left. No cell phone, no GPS, just me and the forest. I packed water, some snacks, and my camera. The trail started just a few hundred yards from the cabin. It was narrow, covered with pine needles and scattered rocks. At first, it felt magical. The way the trees formed a canopy, the soft sounds of squirrels and birds. I walked slowly, taking pictures of wildflowers and mossy logs. The sun broke through the fog as the day warmed up. After about an hour, the trail split into 2. The left path looked more worn and wider, the right path narrower and less traveled. I chose the right, drawn by the quiet and the mystery. The trees grew thicker and closer, and the sunlight dimmed. I noticed the air grew cooler and smelled different, like damp earth and decaying leaves. I kept going, enjoying the solitude, until I heard something unusual. A low snapping sound, like a branch breaking. I stopped immediately. The forest fell silent except for my heartbeat. I scanned the trees around me. Nothing moved. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or a squirrel. But then, I heard it again, a little closer this time. Snap, snap, fast footsteps crunching leaves. I wasn't sure if it was coming toward me or away, but it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to panic, so I turned around and walked briskly back the way I came. The trail looked the same, but my sense of direction felt off. The woods seemed denser, and the shadows darker. I glanced at my watch. 2 hours had passed since I started, but I had seen no sign of anyone else on the trail. No footprints, no litter, no trail markers beyond what I'd passed earlier. I decided to trust my instincts and keep moving toward what I hoped was the cabin. The footsteps had stopped, but the tension remained. Then, without warning, I spotted a figure standing a few yards ahead, just off the trail between the trees. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing dirty jeans and a worn leather jacket. His face was hidden under a baseball cap, but his posture was rigid. He didn't move or speak, just stared at me. I froze. My heart hammered. Something about him didn't feel right. I tried to appear calm, slowly taking a step back. He took a step forward. I turned and started walking faster, almost running now, branches scraping my arms and legs. The footsteps behind me followed. I didn't dare look back. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly. I could hear my breathing, ragged and loud in my ears. My legs burned, but I pushed harder. Then I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my palms on the dirt. Pain shot through my wrists, but I scrambled up and ran. After what felt like an eternity, the trees suddenly thinned and I saw the lake glimmering in the sunlight. Relief flooded me. I sprinted toward the cabin, barely stopping until I reached the porch. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I could hear nothing outside except the gentle lap of water on the shore. I checked the windows carefully. No sign of the man. I kept the door locked and sat by the wood stove, trying to steady my breath. I thought about calling 911, but there was no cell signal. I only had the cabin phone, but the owner had warned it only worked for local calls, not emergencies. The rest of the day passed slowly. I didn't leave the cabin. I kept a knife close by and piled firewood near the door. I watched the woods, waiting for any movement, but nothing came. Night fell again, colder and darker than the first. I lit every candle I had and kept the fire roaring. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and distant coyotes howled. Every little noise made me jump. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. I imagined the man waiting outside, hiding behind trees, watching me. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay trapped inside. I needed to get help or leave before the man returned. I gathered my things, packed everything quickly, and planned to hike back the way I came to the main road. I left the cabin cautiously, scanning the trees as I moved. The forest was quiet and still. I kept my knife in my hand, ready. I walked quickly, using the sun's position to guide me. After an hour, I broke through the trees and found the dirt road. I followed it, hoping to see a car or house. The road was empty, but I heard an engine in the distance. My heart leapt. I waved my arms wildly when a pickup truck appeared. The driver slowed and pulled over. The man looked middle-aged, friendly, and surprised to see me. I told him quickly that I had been staying at the cabin and felt threatened by someone in the woods. He nodded seriously and told me he was a local hunter. He offered to drive me back to town and call the police. When we reached the sheriff's office, I gave a full description of the man I'd seen. They said they'd send officers to check the area immediately. 2 days later, I heard back. The police had found the man, a drifter with a criminal record for assault and burglary, living in a hidden campsite deep in the forest. He had been watching the cabin for days, waiting for someone alone. I never went back to the cabin. The experience left me shaken, but also grateful I had trusted my instincts and escaped when I did. The forest isn't a place for stories or ghosts. It's a place where real dangers hide, and you have to be alert to survive. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural, but very real, very close, and waiting in the shadows. I had never been to the family cabin in Silver Pines until that summer. It was a modest, weathered structure sitting on the edge of a thick forest that stretched beyond the small lake. My father, who passed away 3 years before, used to talk about it often. How he and his siblings spent their childhood summers there, fishing, hiking, and just escaping the city noise. After his death, the cabin had been empty, locked away and untouched. My mother suggested I go and check on it, maybe take care of the upkeep, since she couldn't manage the drive or the work herself. I was 29 at the time and still living in Minneapolis. Work was routine, and life felt a little hollow, just the noise of the city and office walls. I figured a week in the quiet woods could do me good. I packed my bags, my old camping gear, and drove the 6 hours north, following winding roads that eventually gave way to gravel and then dirt paths. The further I got from the city, the quieter it became. No traffic sounds, no buzzing neon signs, just the calls of distant birds and the rustling of trees in the wind. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly how I imagined. Small, wooden, with a sagging roof and a chimney that hadn't seen fire in a while. Moss clung to the shingles, and vines crept up the sides. The paint was peeling, faded from decades of sun and storms. The windows were dirty, coated with dust and dead insects. The whole place smelled of pine, damp earth, and old wood. The door was locked tight. Luckily, I still had the key Dad had given me the last time I visited as a kid, though I barely remembered that visit. I turned the key and pushed the door open. A wave of musty air hit me, like the cabin had been holding its breath for years. Inside, the floor creaked under my weight. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight that peeked through the grimy windows. The main room was small but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with an iron grate and some old logs stacked nearby. A worn couch sat against another wall, covered in faded plaid fabric. A small wooden table was near the window with a couple of chairs. There were shelves with dusty books and faded photographs, most showing Dad and his brothers as kids, smiling with fishing poles and campfires. I set my bags down and started opening windows. Fresh air came rushing in, carrying the scent of pine needles and the lake. The cabin creaked with every gust, the wooden beams shifting slightly, and I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. This was a place frozen in time, untouched by years, and yet something about it felt off. I spent the afternoon cleaning, sweeping out decades of dirt and leaves that had blown in through the cracks. I found some old canned goods in the cupboard, long expired, but I wasn't hungry anyway. Instead, I went outside and walked along the edge of the lake. The water was cold and clear, reflecting the blue sky and tall trees. I found a small dock, rickety but still standing, and sat down, dipping my hands into the chilly water. As evening came, I built a fire in the fireplace. The crackling flames brought a little warmth and light to the cabin. I cooked some canned beans over the fire, eating slowly, watching shadows dance on the walls. Outside, the forest grew dark and silent. No cars, no planes, just the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. That night, I lay on the couch wrapped in an old blanket. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan. Somewhere in the distance, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping. The sound was faint but sharp, like a footstep on dry wood. I told myself it was just the forest, animals moving around, but the feeling of being watched settled in my chest. I wasn't used to such silence, such isolation. The next day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I packed a small backpack with water, a knife, and some snacks, and set off down a narrow trail I noticed behind the cabin. The trees grew tall and dense, spruce and fir mostly, with thick undergrowth that snagged at my pants. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing under fallen branches or thick bushes. I walked for a couple of hours, the forest floor soft with pine needles and moss. Birds called out in the distance, and a few squirrels darted up the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I stopped at a small clearing where I found old, rusted cans and pieces of broken glass, signs that maybe others had been here recently, though the trail didn't look maintained. As I turned to head back, I caught sight of something, a figure, maybe between the trees. It was just a quick glimpse, a shadow shifting behind a trunk. I froze, staring, but when I blinked, it was gone. My heart picked up pace, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Back at the cabin, I noticed the door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it tight before leaving. A cold wave washed over me, I stepped inside cautiously, looking around. Nothing seemed out of place except the door. I checked the windows and locks again. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak and rustle outside made me tense. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, outside the cabin. Slow, paced footsteps circling the building. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for the sounds to stop. They didn't. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service here, and the nearest town was miles away. The footsteps faded after some time, leaving only silence again. I stayed awake, fire crackling low in the hearth. The following day, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside, boots, large, heavy tread marks, leading away from the cabin into the woods. I didn't recognize them and had no idea who could be lurking around. The unease grew heavy in my chest. Determined not to let fear win, I spent the day repairing some windows and fixing the screen door. I found an old shotgun in the corner of a closet, Dad's old hunting rifle, and cleaned it, loading shells just in case. It felt strange to prepare like that, but necessary. That evening, I sat by the fire, watching the dark woods beyond the windows. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly. I thought about Dad, about the summers he'd spent here. I wished he was still around. Suddenly, from the edge of the forest, I heard a sharp crack, like a tree limb breaking under heavy weight. Then another. I grabbed the shotgun and went outside, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught nothing but thick shadows. I stayed outside for a long time, moving carefully along the cabin's perimeter. I heard no voices, no animals, just the snapping of branches in the distance. Something was out there, and it wasn't the quiet woods I expected. The next morning, I packed up most of my things, deciding to leave early. I locked the cabin carefully, making sure every bolt and latch was secure. I left a note for my mother, telling her I didn't think it was safe to stay alone. Driving away, I looked back at the cabin through the rearview mirror. It sat quietly among the trees, a small wooden speck swallowed by the forest. I felt relief but also sadness. The place held memories, but it was no longer a safe refuge. I haven't returned since. Sometimes, I think about that summer, about the silence, the shadows, and the footsteps in the dark. The cabin in Silver Pines is more than just old wood and memories. It's a reminder that some places, even those we love, can hide dangers we don't fully understand. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the constant buzz of the city. I was 29 then, living in Minneapolis, and the stress from my job was getting to me. I'd been feeling overwhelmed for months. Long hours at the office, little sleep, and no real time to clear my head. My dog, Max, a big black Labrador with an easygoing nature, had been my constant companion through all of it. Max was 7 years old then, and as much as I loved the city, I knew he needed some fresh air and space to run. I'd found a cabin online about 3 hours north, just past the small town of Ely, Minnesota. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by tall pines, near a small lake called Echo Lake. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a porch that overlooked the water. I liked the sound of being somewhere quiet, somewhere I could disconnect. Max loved the outdoors, so I figured this would be perfect for both of us. I packed my car with the bare essentials: clothes, food, water, camping gear just in case, and plenty of food for Max. The drive was peaceful, the roads narrowing as I got further from the city, the trees closing in on either side like a green tunnel. When I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the forest. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine, earth, and water. The cabin was even better than the pictures. It had a wood stove in the living room, some old but sturdy furniture, and a small dock leading into the lake. I let Max out right away, and he raced off into the trees, sniffing everything eagerly. I set up the small fire pit just outside and started unloading my things. That first evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the lake shimmer in the fading light. Max lay at my feet, tired from running, but alert. The only sounds were the occasional call of a loon, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the crackling of the fire. The first night was quiet, and I slept better than I had in months. Max stayed close, curled up at the foot of the bed. The next morning, I went for a long walk through the woods with him, following a faint trail that led deeper into the forest. The air was cool and crisp, the sun filtering through the canopy in golden beams. Max was happy, occasionally stopping to sniff or dig at something in the underbrush. As the day went on, I spent time fishing off the dock, reading, and cooking simple meals. The isolation felt good, like I was finally unplugging. At night, the forest was alive with sounds. Owls hooting, insects buzzing, branches creaking. But it felt safe. Max didn't seem bothered, and I trusted him. On the third day, something shifted. I was out on the dock, casting my line into the lake, when I noticed footprints in the mud near the shore. They looked fresh, too big for Max's paws, and not like any animal I recognized. I stared at them for a while, my heart rate speeding up. The forest had felt so empty before, but now I realized someone else had been here recently. I took pictures of the prints, then walked back to the cabin quickly, Max close behind. I locked the doors and windows before going inside. Max was alert, his ears perked and tail stiff. He kept looking toward the door, growling low in his throat. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside, a branch snapping, a distant animal cry, set me on edge. The next morning, I found more signs outside, broken branches, a small pile of discarded trash near the fire pit, and more footprints circling the cabin. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They'd stayed. I thought about leaving then, but part of me wanted to understand what was going on. I called the ranger station in town, and they said there hadn't been any reports of trouble, but the area was known for occasional trespassers. They suggested I be careful and stay inside after dark. For the next 2 days, I stayed mostly indoors, letting Max out only for short walks. I kept the cabin locked, the curtains drawn, and the fire pit cold. Every time I heard footsteps crunching in the underbrush, I tensed. Max growled at shadows, his usual calm replaced by unease. One afternoon, while I was out gathering firewood near the edge of the forest, I spotted a figure watching me from between 2 trees. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure was a man, dressed in dark clothes, face hidden in shadow. He didn't move. I called Max, and he barked loudly, breaking the silence. The man disappeared before I could get a good look. That night was the worst. I heard footsteps all around the cabin, circling slowly. I sat by the window with Max, holding a hunting knife I'd found in the cabin drawer. The wind picked up, making the trees groan, and I could swear I saw shadows moving just beyond the edge of the porch light. At one point, something hit the side of the cabin, a rock, I think. It made a loud thud that echoed through the night. Max barked furiously, and I felt my chest tighten. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, watching the woods. Morning never came fast enough. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I packed my things quickly. I didn't want to wait another night. Max was restless but calm, sensing my urgency. I locked the cabin, leaving the keys on the kitchen table as a sign I wouldn't be back soon. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The quiet forest now felt like it was watching, waiting. When I reached the highway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. At home, I installed better locks, got a security system, and decided that the cabin trip would be a lesson in trusting my gut. I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. It's the real people out there, the ones you don't see until it's too late. Max and I never went back to that cabin. But every now and then, when the wind rustles the trees outside our apartment window, I think about those nights in the woods and the man who watched from the shadows. It reminds me to stay alert, to listen to the small warning signs, and to trust that sometimes getting away is the best thing you can do. I was 33 when I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin in Colorado. It was 2021, late September, and I'd been burnt out from work and personal stuff. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and my job at the time, a logistics coordinator for a small transport company, was weighing me down. I needed to shut the world out for a bit. No phone, no emails, no small talk. Just trees, cold air, and nothing. I found a listing on a site for short-term cabin rentals. It was a one-room log cabin located near South Fork, Colorado, about 10 miles out from the main road, nestled in a dense patch of spruce and pine. It wasn't fancy, no electricity, no running water, just a propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and an outhouse about 20 yards from the door. It had a simple bed, a desk, and a couple of wooden chairs. What sold me was the seclusion. The owner, a retired guy named Curtis, said in his description that he rarely rented it out and that cell reception was non-existent. I arrived there around 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday. The drive-in was rough, just miles of dirt road with the occasional washout or rock slide debris. My SUV made it okay, but I took it slow. The last few miles were thick with trees on both sides. When I got to the clearing and saw the cabin, I felt a weird mix of calm and nervousness. It was just me now.
No distractions.
The cabin looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The logs were grayish, weathered from years of sun and snow. The metal chimney poked through the roof, bent slightly. I walked the perimeter first, just checking things out. There was an old axe stuck into a log out back. A pile of split wood was neatly stacked under a tarp. Everything seemed in order. I unloaded my gear, sleeping bag, cooler with some food, a couple of books, a headlamp, flashlight, first aid kit, and a small handgun I kept in a locked box in my pack. I wasn't paranoid, just careful. I'd never had to use it, but it helped me sleep easier knowing it was there. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. I'd spent time outdoors before, camping with friends, backpacking in Oregon, but being completely alone, without even the distant hum of a highway or the flicker of a nearby campfire, was new. I read for a bit, then sat outside under the stars for an hour before turning in. The sounds at night were strange. Ulls, rustling in the trees, branches creaking, wind. The fireplace crackled, but even that seemed loud in the silence. I didn't sleep much, not deeply. I kept waking up, staring at the ceiling beams, ears tuned in to every thump or pop. Friday morning, I went on a long hike. There was a trail behind the cabin that Curtis had marked on a faded map left on the desk. It wasn't well maintained, but it climbed a ridge about 2 miles west, offering a clear view of the valley below. I made it up in about an hour, sweaty but clear-headed. I sat there for a while, watching hawks circle above the trees. No people.
No voices.
It was beautiful. I got back to the cabin around 2 p.m., ate a late lunch, and chopped some firewood just to keep busy. I'd brought a solar-powered lantern, and I left it out to charge while I worked. Around 5, I cooked some soup on the propane burner and made tea. The quiet started to feel good, like I could finally breathe again. That night, though, something changed. I had just finished stacking the last log on the fire when I heard footsteps outside. It was faint, just a crunch in the leaves near the side window. I froze. The firelight flickered behind me, and the cabin's interior shifted with shadows. I listened again. Nothing. I walked slowly to the window and leaned in, careful not to bump it or make a sound. It was too dark outside to see much. The trees formed a black wall just past the clearing. I waited, staring out, trying to let my eyes adjust. Then I saw it. A shape moved between the trees. Not an animal. It was upright, human. I didn't panic, but my stomach dropped. I stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. Curtis said the nearest cabin was 5 miles away. No one should be walking around my place at 9 p.m. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it off before putting it in my coat pocket. Then I unlocked the box under my pack and took out the gun, just in case. I waited another 30 minutes without hearing anything else. I told myself it could have been a hunter or someone who got lost. But no flashlight, no call for help, just walking. At some point, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Saturday, I stepped outside as soon as the sun came up and walked the perimeter. That's when I found the tracks. They weren't boots, more like worn sneakers. Tread was shallow. The prints circled behind the cabin, near the woodpile, and led back into the trees. I followed them for a little while. They weaved between the trunks and disappeared into the underbrush. I stopped after 100 feet or so. I didn't like the idea of someone watching me sleep. I walked back, locked the door, and made coffee on the stove. I kept the gun nearby now. The woods didn't feel calm anymore. I debated leaving, packing up early, driving out. But I also felt like maybe I was overreacting. Maybe someone had wandered through, didn't know the cabin was occupied. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That afternoon, it rained. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up. Water tapped the windows in fast bursts. I stayed inside, read half a book, and watched the trees sway outside. It got colder, so I fed the fire early. When it got dark, I made sure everything was locked, door, windows, even the little latch on the outhouse. At 2:10 a.m., I woke up to something tapping on the glass. It was soft at first. Top, top, top. I sat up, heart instantly racing. The fire had gone out, and the room was dark. I clicked on my headlamp and pointed it at the window. Nothing. I waited, held my breath. Top, top, top. This time it came from the opposite window, the one near the door. I grabbed the gun, moved slowly toward the window, and peeked through the side. I saw the back of someone's head. They were crouched low, like they were trying to stay hidden, pressed against the wall under the window. Brown hood, dirty. Could have been a man. Could have been a teenager. Couldn't tell. I stepped back, heart slamming in my chest. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to confront anyone. I wanted them gone. But I knew they knew I was inside. I kept the lights off. I waited, just standing there, clutching the gun, listening. Then the handle moved. The doorknob turned a 1/4 inch and stopped. Rattled gently. They were testing it. I raised the gun but said nothing. Just stood there, frozen. I could hear them breathing. Close, maybe 6 feet from where I was standing. Then it stopped. I waited 10 more minutes. Didn't move. No more sounds. Eventually, I peeked again. They were gone. I stayed awake until the sun rose, barely breathing. The second it was light, I stepped out, looking everywhere. The ground was soaked from the rain, and the mud made the prints clear. They circled the whole cabin this time, stopped near every window. The same shoes. They had been watching. I packed my things in under 10 minutes, tossed everything into the back of the SUV, and peeled out down that dirt road without stopping. I didn't tell Curtis. I didn't leave a review. I didn't report it. What was I going to say? That someone walked around my cabin and tried the door? No crime had technically happened. and I hadn't seen a face, just a figure. I drove to a small motel in Alamosa and stayed there the next night. Slept with the TV on, locked the door twice, didn't relax until I got back home to Arizona 2 days later. I haven't been camping since. Whatever that person wanted, whoever they were, they knew I was alone. They waited for dark. They walked around my cabin. They tapped on the windows. They tested the lock. They never said a word, and I never saw their face. I was 29 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was in late October 2019. I'd been living in Oregon for 5 years at that point, working full-time in IT support for a school district in Medford. My life had turned into a loop: work, sleep, eat, repeat. No relationships, no family close by. I wasn't depressed or anything dramatic like that. I just felt like I was existing more than living. The stress had piled up without me realizing it. So when I came across an old listing on a hiking forum about some trails near the Fremont-Winema National Forest, I made a quick decision. Someone had written about a stretch of land near Bly, Oregon. Remote, wooded, not trafficked by anyone since most of the paths had become overgrown. The poster had mentioned an old Firewatch road that led to a ridge with a few good views. I didn't care about the views. What interested me was that they had seen an old, broken-down cabin at the foot of one of the logging roads. They didn't go in, just took a picture from a distance and left. It sparked something in me. I didn't want a nice trail with benches and signs. I didn't want any other people around. I just wanted to be alone in a place I'd never seen before. Something quiet, something still. I packed light. A 4-season tent, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried meals, GPS, basic tools, and a .22 pistol I kept locked up at home. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I figured it was smart to have it. I took Friday and Monday off work and left town at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. The drive out was long and the roads got worse the deeper I went into the woods. The last leg was a dirt path that hadn't been maintained in years. Branches scraped the sides of my SUV. I went slow, careful not to pop a tire on the rocks or get stuck in mud. I stopped a few times to get my bearings and ended up finding what looked like the path that had been mentioned in the forum post. Barely wide enough for a vehicle and lined with trees leaning in like they wanted to hide the road altogether. I parked about a half-mile in and grabbed my pack. I didn't expect to find the cabin. If anything, I figured the post was old and maybe the thing had collapsed by now. But I followed the overgrown trail anyway, using my GPS to mark where I left the car. After about 30 minutes of slow, careful walking, I came over a small rise and saw it through the trees. It was real. The cabin was maybe 50 feet away, set down a slight slope. The roof had partially caved in, but the frame was still mostly intact. It was smaller than I imagined, probably only one room. No porch, just a wooden front wall with a door hanging slightly off its hinges. The trees were thick around it, and the moss growing up the side gave it a greenish hue. The silence was heavy. I walked around it once. No obvious signs of animals or recent human activity. No tire tracks, no litter. It felt like this place had been forgotten completely. The door creaked when I nudged it open. Inside, it was dark but dry. The sun came through the broken roof beams in long rays that lit up the dust in the air. There was a rusted metal stove in one corner, a busted table in the center, and a collapsed wooden cot against the far wall. I spent maybe 10 minutes inside, then went back out and set up my tent a short distance uphill from the cabin, near a clearing. I didn't want to sleep inside. It looked unsafe, and I liked the idea of having some visibility. That first day was peaceful. I hiked around the area a bit, marked some paths on my GPS, and cooked a small meal before sunset. No animals bothered me, though I saw some deer trails and old scat that looked like it came from a bear. I kept my food locked up in a bear canister, away from the tent. The air got cold fast after sundown, and by 9 p.m., I was zipped in and trying to fall asleep. The first strange thing happened that night. I woke up around 1 a.m. to the sound of something hard hitting wood. Just once. A single thunk, like something had fallen or knocked into a tree. I lay still, listening. The forest was otherwise quiet. I assumed it was a branch or maybe a pine cone dropping from a high limb, but it had sounded close. I stayed awake for another hour before finally drifting off again. The next day, I explored further out. I found a dried-up creek bed about a mile east, some old fence posts that had long since rotted, and more animal tracks. I took some photos on my phone and noted where the forest got denser. I saw no other cabins, no campsites, no other signs of people. Around noon, I returned to the cabin to take a better look inside. This time, I noticed a few more things. In the corner by the stove, under a pile of debris, I found a dented tin box. It was empty, but had a burned patch on one side and smelled faintly like old gasoline. I also noticed something carved into the inside of the door, 3 deep, crude lines etched into the wood. They didn't look like letters or numbers, just marks. Could have been anything, but they didn't look random. I took some more photos and went back to my tent. That second night, the knocking sound came again, closer this time. 2 sharp thuds, not spaced out. 1, 2, like someone knocking on a door. It woke me up instantly. My skin went cold. I didn't move for a long time. I listened hard, trying to hear footsteps or branches snapping, but the woods were dead quiet again. Not even wind. I reached for the pistol in the dark and held it across my chest. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I saw prints. Not animal prints, boots. Faint, in the dirt near the path leading to the cabin. I hadn't noticed them the day before. They were shallow but clearly human. At least 2 different sets. One looked like a heavy tread, maybe from work boots. The other was lighter, flatter. I hadn't passed anyone on the way in, and this was far from any active trail. Something felt off. I packed up my gear and decided to leave early. But when I hiked back to my car, I found the rear driver's side tire completely flat. Not slashed, but punctured. A sharp piece of bone, looked like a deer antler fragment, was jammed into the tread. Could have been coincidence. Could have happened on the way in. But it didn't sit right with me. I changed the tire as fast as I could. I was just about to get in and go when I saw something in the tree line about 20 feet back. Something hanging. I walked over, heart pounding. It was a shirt, faded red flannel nailed to a tree. Old, sun-bleached, but with fresh tears at the sleeves, like it had been shredded on purpose. That was it for me. I drove out slow but steady, watching my mirrors, checking the forest on both sides. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I drove all the way back to Medford that night, got home around 10:30 p.m., locked my doors, and sat in silence for a long time before going to bed. I didn't tell anyone about it. Who would I tell? And what would I say? A few weeks later, I went back online to the same hiking forum to find the post again. It was gone, deleted. The user account had been deactivated. I thought about reporting what I saw, about the footprints, the shirt, the knocking in the night, but there was no real crime, no real evidence, just strange pieces. I still think about that place sometimes, about the boot prints, about the marks on the cabin door. I don't know who else was out there or why they stayed so quiet, but I do know one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't alone, and I don't think I was meant to find that cabin. I haven't gone camping since. In the fall of 2016, I was 29 years old and working as a surveyor for a small land development firm in western Colorado. It was the kind of job where you'd spend most of the week outside, mapping undeveloped stretches of land, crawling through underbrush, and walking for miles just to place a few colored stakes in the ground. I liked the job mostly because it kept me away from people. I'd gotten used to the quiet, the kind that comes from being out in the middle of nowhere with only the wind and your own breathing to keep you company. That October, I was assigned to a remote plot about 15 miles outside the town of Creak. The company had bought a small tract of wooded land and wanted a complete topographical survey before deciding whether to develop it. I was to spend a week there alone, doing the initial survey and marking out key elevations and boundaries. There were no roads directly to the site, so I had to park my truck a mile off an old service road and hike the rest of the way in. The company kept an old cabin on the edge of the land for projects like this. Single room, no plumbing, no electricity, just a cot, a wood stove, and a rusted lock on the door. I'd stayed in places like it before. They were usually quiet, kind of peaceful in their own way. This one looked a little more run down than the others, the roof sagging slightly and the chimney leaning off to one side. But it was dry, and the stove worked, so I wasn't going to complain. The first few days were routine. I woke early, made instant coffee with a portable propane stove, packed my bag, and set out for the day's section of the grid. I had my surveyor's tripod, rangefinder, and topographic maps. The terrain was mostly forested, dotted with thick pine and aspen groves. The ground was uneven in places, with old dry creek beds and rocky ridges cutting across my grid. On the third morning, I noticed something strange. While walking out past a shallow draw, I found a set of footprints in the soft dirt. Not boot prints, bare feet. They looked fairly fresh, human. They trailed off deeper into the woods and vanished near some thicker brush. I figured it might have been a local hunter or someone camping illegally. Still, it was weird. That land wasn't easy to get to, and I hadn't seen another person in days. I took a photo and kept moving. That night, I double-checked the cabin door before sleeping. It only had a slide bolt and a basic padlock, but I didn't want to take chances. I kept my machete, the one I used for clearing brush, next to the cot just in case. I wasn't scared exactly, just more aware of how far out I was. No cell signal, no neighbors. If something happened, no one was coming. The next day started normally, but around noon I found something else. An old deer carcass about 30 yards off one of my stake points. It looked like it had been dead for a few days, but it wasn't scavenged the way you'd expect. No bite marks on the hindquarters, which is usually the first thing coyotes or mountain lions go for. The rib cage had been cracked open down the center, almost cleanly, like someone had used a tool. The hide was still on, but peeled back in strips. It didn't make sense. I took another photo, marked the location, and tried not to think too much about it. Still, I cut my day short and headed back early. I kept glancing over my shoulder during the walk. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there with me, not watching exactly, but somewhere nearby. That night it got worse. I was in the cabin with the stove going and my flashlight on the table when I heard movement outside. Not animals, not wind, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the dried pine needles around the cabin. They circled once, then stopped just out of the light from the window. I didn't move. I just sat there, breathing shallow and quiet. After about 5 minutes, the footsteps started again, one step at a time, then silence. When I finally got up the nerve to peek through the crack in the window, there was nothing out there, just trees and shadows. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the flashlight on until the batteries died and sat with my back to the wall, machete in my lap. The next morning, I found new footprints, same bare feet. This time, they circled the cabin, stopped at the window, and disappeared into the woods. They were too small to belong to a large man, too narrow, too clean. No sign of boots, no drag marks, like someone had been walking out there barefoot for days, maybe longer. I packed up my gear and left for the day, more out of habit than focus. My mind wasn't in it. I was distracted, checking the tree line constantly, listening for anything out of place. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a patch of bark stripped off a pine about shoulder height. It looked fresh, and the scrape marks were long and smooth. Not claw marks, something flat had done it. Something sharp. Near the base of that tree, I found another carcass. This time it was a rabbit. Same pattern, skin peeled, chest opened. But this one had been pinned to the dirt with a sharpened stick driven straight through its torso, like someone had left it there on purpose. I left early again. On the walk back, I could feel it. Someone behind me. Not close, but there. I never saw them. Never heard anything more than twigs breaking now and then. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, I kept the fire low and sat with the stove door cracked open to keep some light without drawing attention to the window. At some point after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they stopped at the door. For a long time, it was just silence. Then the latch rattled. Gently at first, like someone trying it quietly. I stood up, machete in hand, and moved toward the door. I didn't say anything. I just waited, heart pounding, not breathing. The latch rattled again, harder. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt louder than anything. I waited for what felt like an hour. Nothing. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed my gear and started writing up a fake equipment malfunction note to send to my manager as an excuse to leave early. I had to hike to the truck and drive 20 miles back to town to find a signal. I was done. Whatever was going on out there, I didn't want to be a part of it. As I stepped outside the cabin, I noticed something on the door. Scratches. Not from claws, but from fingernails. 5 thin lines, dug deep into the wood, from top to bottom. Like someone had dragged their hand down the door slowly. There were more on the sides of the cabin, under the windows. I hadn't heard them. I didn't look back after that. I hiked fast, didn't stop once. Got in my truck, locked the doors, and drove straight to the office. I told my manager there was a problem with my rangefinder, that I needed a new one and couldn't finish the job. I didn't mention the footprints or the animals. He didn't ask. 2 weeks later, another guy was sent to finish the survey. I never saw him again, but I heard through a coworker that he came back after one day and asked to be reassigned. Said the cabin creeped him out. Said he felt like someone was watching him all night. He didn't go into details. I didn't press. I didn't want to know. It's been years since then. I don't work in the field anymore. I do office work now, land use permits, zoning reports. Sometimes I still think about that week, about the bare footprints, about the carcasses, about the thing that wasn't afraid to come right up to the cabin and try the door like it belonged there. People call stories like that skinwalker stuff. I don't know what I believe. All I know is that it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person, a real person, out there in the woods living like something else. And that's what scared me the most. Not that it was inhuman, that it was. I was 34 that year, in a strange place in life, working remotely after switching careers, recently out of a long relationship, and craving a quiet place to reset. After a few months of feeling stuck in my small apartment in Des Moines, I rented a modest farm cabin near the outskirts of Clark County. It sat off a gravel road no one used unless they lived nearby, surrounded by soybean fields, thick lines of maple and oak, and what looked like miles of open space in every direction. The listing made it seem like an artist's retreat, and it was cheap. The idea of spending a few months alone sounded like just what I needed. I arrived in mid-September. The cabin was older than I expected, small and square, with worn wood siding stained a deep brown and a sagging tin roof. It had one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a living area with a stone fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years.
No TV.
No internet unless I used my phone hotspot. There was an old barn about 40 yards to the east, partially collapsed and overrun with tall weeds. The property manager, a guy named Ken, left the key in the mailbox and texted me a short message that just said, "Let me know if you need anything. Nearest neighbors about a mile west." Felt peaceful at first. There were no cars, no city sounds, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional cow bellowing in the distance. The air smelled clean. The place was dusty but livable. I swept out some dead bugs, unpacked my groceries, and opened the windows to let the stale air out. I stayed up that first night sitting on the front porch with a beer, watching the sun bleed out behind the tree line. Everything felt still. I settled into a routine. Mornings started with coffee and a walk through the soybean field behind the cabin. I'd come back and work until mid-afternoon, then either read or fix something around the place. It didn't take long before I started noticing things. Not ghost stuff, nothing supernatural, but things that didn't sit right. First, it was just small stuff. The door to the barn was closed when I arrived, but the third day I went out there, it was open. I figured it was the wind, or maybe I just misremembered. The barn smelled like animal waste and mold, and there were broken tools scattered on the ground, rusted from years of neglect. I didn't go in far. About a week in, I started seeing the same tire tracks along the gravel path near the gate. That might not sound like much, but I wasn't expecting anyone to be out there. It was private property. I hadn't left the property since I arrived, and I hadn't had any deliveries or visitors. The tracks weren't from my car, and they didn't match Ken's old pickup that I'd seen in his photos. They were narrow, like from an ATV or a smaller truck. I called Ken once to ask if anyone else was supposed to be on the property. He just said no, and that he hadn't been out there since summer. I didn't press him. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone cutting across the field. Maybe hunters. Still, I started locking the doors at night. Then came the sounds. Late one night, probably close to 1 a.m., I woke up to what I thought was an animal near the side of the house. A heavy scuffling, like something large moving through the dead leaves. I sat up in bed, trying to decide if it was worth checking out. Eventually, I just went back to sleep. It didn't seem like much, but the next night it happened again, and then again. The third time, I got out of bed and stood at the window for maybe 10 minutes, staring out into the dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the faint crunch of steps. Then silence. I left the porch light on after that. A few days passed without anything weird, and I let it go. But on a windy Thursday afternoon, while chopping wood behind the cabin, I found something. It was just off the path I used for my morning walks, maybe 15 feet into the trees. Someone had built a little shelter. Nothing elaborate, just a bunch of sticks leaned against a dead log and covered in brush. Inside, I found a blanket rolled into a bundle, a stained plastic water jug, and 2 crushed cans of chili. It had been used recently.
No dust. No spider webs.
I didn't touch anything. I just walked back to the cabin and stood in the kitchen for a while, thinking. That night, I moved a chair to face the window and sat there for a long time, watching the yard. I left the lights off so I could see outside. Nothing moved, but I didn't sleep well. The next day, I walked to the edge of the field and followed the old tractor path toward where the shelter was. It was gone. The log was still there, but the sticks had been pulled away and the trash was gone. Not scattered, gone. I stood there for a long time, my boots sinking into the soft dirt, just listening. I didn't tell anyone. Felt like something I could handle. I kept telling myself it was just someone camping out, maybe a squatter, maybe they had just left, but something about it stayed in the back of my mind. Then things escalated. I went into town one day just to get groceries and top off my gas. I was gone for maybe 3 hours. When I came back, the cabin door was open. I was sure I'd locked it. Nothing was taken, at least nothing obvious. But the bedroom window was cracked, and there were muddy boot prints on the floor near the back door. Not mine. I wear size 12. These were smaller. I checked every corner of the cabin with a hammer in hand. No one was there. After that, I started carrying a flashlight and the hammer with me everywhere, even to the bathroom. The following week, I caught a glimpse of someone. It was just before sunset. I was in the kitchen making rice. I glanced out the window above the sink and saw movement near the barn. At first I thought it was a deer, but it wasn't. It was a person, low to the ground, slipping into the shadows behind the barn. I ran outside without thinking, but they were already gone. I circled the barn, yelling out without saying anything. No answer. I felt like a fool. The next day, I bought a motion sensor light in town and mounted it on the porch. I also moved my car behind the house so it wasn't visible from the road. Then came the worst night. It was cold, maybe 38 degrees. Around 3 a.m., I woke up because the motion light came on. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside, slow and heavy, moving along the porch. I sat up, heart hammering, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the window. I didn't dare move. Then I heard the door handle jiggle. Once, then again, then silence. I stayed in bed, clutching the hammer until the sun came up. In the morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch and a fresh gouge in the wood of the doorframe, like someone had used a screwdriver or knife to try and pry it open. I packed that afternoon. I didn't even wait until the next day. I sent Ken a message saying something had come up and I had to leave early. I never got a reply. I drove straight back to Des Moines, checked into a hotel, and didn't go back for my last few things. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove down the same gravel road just to see the place from a distance. The cabin was still there, the barn still half collapsed. But something caught my eye. There was a truck parked by the barn. It wasn't Ken's. It was a white Ford Ranger with a broken driver's side mirror. I didn't stop. I just turned around and left. I never found out who was out there or what they wanted. I never reported anything. Part of me thinks maybe I should have, but another part of me is glad I just left. Whoever it was, they had been living near the cabin, watching me. Maybe longer than I realized. Maybe since the first night. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't monsters. It was just a person. And that, I've come to learn, is much worse.